Eventually, though, some Romans caught wise and had to say, this is brutal, this is barbaric, and they stopped. Yes?
It was.
Say it loud.
It's a good one was from what Nero did was kind of a little bit worse than that.
Some games were worse than that.
Yeah, what Nero did was a little bit worse than that. He liked to put on shows, and if you ever went to the Myth of Hercules, at the end he gets burned alive to go to Olympus or whatever they wanted him to go. He had questions where the tunic was, so basically he said they put guys in the arena and set the tunic on fire.
Yeah, well, yeah, they burned people alive with some of these. In other words, they had a thirst for blood. But now, there is a story, though, that a young Christian named Telemachus did not know what he was getting into, and a friend of his said, hey, let's go to the Colosseum. Went to the Colosseum and watched one gladiator kill another. He decided this was wrong, so when the next two gladiators started to fight, he stepped between them and shouted out to the crowd, who all of a sudden got silent. Who is this man? He said, hey, this is evil, this is wrong. Well, the gladiators killed him. But then the Roman people got to thinking about it, and they stopped going to the gladiatorial shows. Eventually, the gladiatorial shows were stopped. It was one of the few reforms that came about late in the Roman Empire that were for the better. It was said that some of the emperors lighted their, you might say, lighted their driveway, for lack of a better word, I'll use the term driveway, or lighted their way to their mansion with human torches. In other words, they'd light up human beings, and also they lighted the Colosseums with humans and set them on fire. I believe it's something like what you were referring to. In other words, they had issues, things that we would call inhumane that they did in those days. And sometimes the beasts would kill each other. They put wild beasts fighting each other. Bears would fight buffaloes, whatever. All just for bloodthirst. Now, we had a case where a very prominent Atlantan, some of you may know who I'm talking about, was caught setting up a dog fighting ring where the dogs would get at each other and kill each other, and this man served some time in jail for funding it. He did not get involved, well, yes, he did, but he funded the dog fighting. So we have still a little bit of this going on. 180, 200 years ago, a lot of Americans enjoyed rooster fighting, where two roosters get together, called cockfighting. And believe it or not, Abe Lincoln enjoyed attending these fighting matches, where the two roosters would fight each other to the death, and they believed that this was good entertainment. Now, in a little town in southern Italy called Pompeii, a volcano erupted. Weirdly enough, right now in September 29, 2014, a volcano or so is making news right now in Japan. But anyway, a volcano erupted and destroyed the town of Pompeii here in southern Italy. Eventually, archaeologists was able to go into the town. Now, a lot of persons who saw the volcano erupt left right away. They survived. They were apparently the smarter ones. Some people said, no, we've worked hard all of our life to build this up. We're not going to leave it, because as sure as we leave it, some vandals will come in and steal everything. So some people refused to leave. And when the volcano erupted really big, it covered them up. And in some cases, we actually find the bodies now turned to ash. Or you might say the ashes left an imprint of the bodies, so we can tell where the bodies have been. And in some cases, we actually see the facial expressions. Some of the persons have facial expressions of pure horror, knowing they're going to die. Others have expressions of a calm, serene repose. None of us know how we'd act if facing the same thing. Apparently, some of them could take it fairly calmly. But anyway, the archaeologists have waited 1,700 years before they went in. And then they discovered a lot of things, a lot of writings, a lot of stuff that have given us a good idea of what life was like in the height of the Roman Empire, because this disaster occurred during the Roman height, when the Roman Empire was at its best. All right. Crises. I'm now looking at the top of page 139. During the reign of the 5 good emperors, things were fairly prosperous until you get to the 5th one, last of the good emperors, Marcus Aurelius. Now, he himself is listed as one of the good emperors, and a lot of disasters occurred during his reign he couldn't help. During his reign, there occurred fires, floods, storms, all various kinds of natural disasters, economic reverses, and for the first time in many generations, plagues began to hit. Now, folk, we can't prove it in this case, not decisively. We can in the 1,000 years later. Now, in the 2nd century, that's what time period I'm talking about, in other words, in well, actually in the fourth century, the 4th century, in the 300s, 2 and 300s, Europe experienced a crisis. Now, at the end of the semester, we're going to be talking about another crisis Europe experienced, the crisis of the 14th century. Now, we know for sure the crisis of the 14th century was brought on in large part by a cooling of the climate. It is suspected that the crisis of the 4th century was brought on by a cooling of the climate. And yes, I think this is relevant, so I'm going to digress a little bit. Fast forward to the 21st century, and we are told that the climate is warming up, and we're told that this is the worst possible thing that could happen for mankind. Now, I want to tell you something, folks. Some of you may have heard this already. There was a time in the world's history when the whole world had a uniform tropical climate. Even Antarctica, way down here, had a tropical climate. There was no snow, there was no ice, there was no winter. This was during the Cretaceous period. I mean, if you look it up if you want to. This is standard paleontology. Now, this is not conspiracy history. How many of you have ever heard this before from any other source? At one time, the Earth had one of you, a couple of you, three, 4 of you have heard of it. All right, the Earth had a uniform tropical climate, and life on Earth during this time was never better. This was the age of the dinosaurs, the huge reptiles. It was the age of 300-foot tall trees, of which only a few are left. The oceans were, and there were no deserts. The oceans were teeming with life, and there were no deserts. All of the land area was just abundantly covered with life, plush life. Life was so abundant that a lot of trees broke off the land, and they began floating and making islands that were several miles long and miles wide, floating islands of trees that you could get on and set up your houses or whatever. This was during the Cretaceous period. Life was never better. All the plagues we have recorded in history either have been proven to be or were suspected of being caused by a cooling down. Now, folks, why nobody mentions this, I don't know. In the case of the 4th century, we can't prove it. In the case of the 14th, we can prove it. There was a definite cooling of the climate. We can prove it by studying tree rings, by studying records of what would grow where. We find that crops that would before would grow up this far north, wound up, and now only grow this far south. And when the Vikings came to the New World, they talked about a species of grapes that we now will not grow any farther north in New Jersey, but back then would grow in Nova Scotia. They called Greenland, Greenland, because it was in fact a green land. And the Vikings ever set up and farmed there. Then the climate cooled. All the Vikings died off. They could have learned from the Eskimos, who they looked on the Eskimos as being demons. No, we don't have anything to do with those Eskimos. The Eskimos knew how to survive in that kind of climate, and if the Vikings had copied the Eskimos, they would have survived also. Instead, the Vikings ignored the Eskimos, tried to farm the way they had in Scandinavia. But even in Scandinavia, they were experiencing a Black Death that carried away a third of it. In other words, it wasn't just a population decline occurred in Europe, a population decline occurred in China, and as best as we can tell, a population decline occurred at the same time in North America. So at least all the northern hemisphere suffered as a result of climate change. All right, back to the 4th century. They had a crisis that probably was caused by climate change. Your book says 3rd century, whatever, yeah, 3rd century. You know, in the 200s, 300s, that period of time, things were going downhill. Well, anyway, in the case of Marcus Aurelius, now, there was a movie made, which I once had a copy of, but it got, after 20 years, those old VHS tapes to where they fade after a while and no longer work. Again, the movie Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire says that Marcus Aurelius' son, Commodus, no, I won't write his name down, but Commodus killed his father, poisoned his father. We do not know if this is true or not. But anyway, we do know that all the emperors, most of the emperors before him, were followed by sons that they adopted. And Commodus believed that his father was going to adopt some son and make him emperor, because Commodus himself appeared to be incompetent. So Commodus is accused of killing his father and usurping the throne. And he is blamed in large part for accelerating the decline of the Roman Empire. He set up a calendar where he named all 12 months after himself. I mean, he took 12 titles, and each month was named after one of his titles. He ignored all the uprisings that were going on in the East here and just let the East have its way. And his advice, hey, you've got to fight these people in the Far East. No, we don't have to fight them. And eventually the people rose up against him and killed him. A new dynasty took over, and under the new dynasty, things prospered for a while, but inevitably the decline kept on going. Your book calls it the Severan dynasty. I'm not going to write that name down. Well, yes, Sever. Yes, I will. Sever. I believe I have one question here. During the Severan dynasty, Rome improved temporarily. That dynasty lasted. Then Rome went through a period of time where the emperors came with real lightning-like speed. During a 50-year period, Rome had about 24 emperors. Every one of whom was murdered except for one man who was about 83 when he got to be emperor. He only lasted a few months, and it's believed he died a natural death. Other than that, they set up an emperor, or an emperor would fight his way to the top, last a couple of years, then be assassinated. The next emperor, who would be the one who would assassinate a former emperor, after a few years he'd be assassinated. They had a case. Now, the founder of the Severan dynasty, Septimus Severus, actually purchased the office of emperor. The Romans put the office on the auction block, and by the way, our practice of auction started with Rome, and they sold the office of emperor to the highest bidder. One of the most disgraceful things in all of Roman history. I mean, by judging the 21st century standard. Septimus Severus outbid all the others and got to be emperor.